Welcome to the second episode in the International Network of Government Science Advisors conversational series, Horizons, which is focused on the different aspects of the interface between science, society, policy making, and politics. I'm Peter Gluckman, President of the International Network for Government Science Advice and President-elect of the International Science Council. INGSA is the global network founded 5 years ago to build research and understandings and practice in science advice at every level of governance from local to global. It now has over 5,000 members in 110 countries. While science advice originated in a very different era, where science was projected as being separate from society, we've moved a long way from that. We understand that while science provides the most authoritative way of understanding our world, there is always an inherently provisional nature to the nature of science knowledge. Yet science advice in the early years and in some places is still largely focused on the natural sciences and projected in a somewhat definitive manner. But now, in places such as New Zealand, where I am based, science advice is seen as a much more pluralistic activity involving the social sciences, including economics. And we've seen that in the COVID pandemic, the importance of this more pluralistic view of science advice is becoming much more important. Indeed, the very wicked problems where governments need more than technological advice requires a very different relationship between science, policy making, and those people at the interface between them. I actually don't like the word science. I'd be much more comfortable with the word such as Wissenschaft, which encompasses a much more broader meaning of robust knowledge. But the need for science advice is not unitary. It has multiple purposes, from emergencies to foresighting, from policy option exploration to policy choice and evaluation. Different actors are likely involved, and I like to distinguish between those who generate knowledge, those who synthesize knowledge, and those who translate that knowledge for the policy community. And none of this can be separated from how knowledge is communicated to the public, for the public itself has choices to make in all of this. COVID has clearly brought the interface between science and decision-making to the fore, but not all has gone well. How often have we heard politicians say we are just following the science to justify a manifestly political decision? We've seen in some countries public debate and confusion between those who are charged with giving advice and those who are perhaps angry because they've not been inside the tent. How is access to the policymaker decided? Are different structures needed to better input evidence into the ordinary business of policymaking from that in the business of emergency management? So they're both pragmatic and conceptual issues at stake. And we're particularly privileged today to be joined by Professor Heather Douglas, whose book, Science, Policy and the Values-Free Ideal, punctured the myth of a values-free interaction between science and policy and brought the concept of inferential risk to the fore. For me, I found that Heather's writings at the time I started being a science advisor to be critically valuable. She spoke at the foundational meeting of INGSA in 2014, and both her philosophical and scholarly framing of the issues, while not ignoring the pragmatic realities of science advising, has been critical in the way thinking about science evolving has developed over the last 5 to 6 years. She's currently Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy at Michigan State University and Series Editor of Science, Values and the Public, a very important monograph series in this area, and is a AAAS Fellow. I'm not sure, Heather, where we should start the conversation, but I think perhaps parsing the word values might be a really good place to start, because I think there is confusion in much of the audience I discuss matters with over what we mean when we talk about values in the context of the science policy interface.
So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, and it starts with philosophy of science discussion about values. if we take values to be first and foremost about as an expression of things that we care about, sometimes reflected upon what John Dewey and Matt Brown has more recently called value judgments, where we deliberately make a careful judgment about what it is we should care about, what it is we should focus on, what it is we should try to achieve, an expression of our ideals. Then there are also values that we just hold that we might not realize we hold, about, sort of that are reflected in our habits and practices that reflect things that we care about, but perhaps we haven't made explicit judgment. And we probably want to separate that from thinking about big scale ideologies, worldviews, commitments that mix metaphysical beliefs with perspectives on how one knows, how one should act. Those are often entangled, very complicated things that are hard to pull apart. Whereas we say, values are things that we care about, and value judgments are expressions of things that we should care about with reasons behind them. We might end up in a better position for thinking about the role of values in science.
So, I always found in your book the critical concept that the biggest value judgment a scientist will make will be over the sufficiency and quality of evidence, and particularly when it comes to science advising on contentious issues. I always found actually analyzing for myself the inferential risk between what we know and what we conclude is critical. And I just wonder whether you want to explore that concept further, because I think that people don't recognize there always is an inferential gap between what scientists think and what they say.
Yeah, well, so this begins with the acknowledgement that science is an inductive process, that, we don't actually make claims on the basis of evidence with the sort of deductive inferential certainty that comes with deductive logic. But a lot of people, there's been the problem of induction that philosophers have been trying to solve since Hume. I don't know of any plausible solutions yet. They keep trying. But in the meantime, I think it's perhaps more fruitful to think of the inductive aspect of science as less a weakness, that somehow because you don't know for sure, that's a problem to be solved, rather than a source of strength. And I think this is captured in some sense in Merton's Ethos of Science from 1942, where he argues that, part of the culture of science is this ongoing critical skepticism and debate within science. Well, that can only happen if you don't ever have conclusive evidence that is definitive and sure, and then can become a dogma, right? Science doesn't have that. So because science is always inductive, because it's always ampliative, because the evidence is never totally complete, that means you always have this possibility for critique, for debate, for ongoing reformations of scientific ideas into better theories, creating better evidence, exploring new methodologies. And that's actually what I think makes science so reliable, and why science is the most reliable form of knowledge we have. So I actually think, the inductive and problem of induction is there, but it's instead a source of strength for the knowledge that science produces. But then you have a particular moment, right? You've done a bunch of studies, you have a bunch of evidence, and you have to decide, what is this evidence? What am I willing to say at this point in time? You could go through as a scientist and say, here's all the evidence that we found, right? And just stop there. But that's not very helpful for advising. It might be very helpful, be exactly what you should do for your fellow scientists, maybe, although scientists tend to want to draw conclusions at their end of their papers about what the evidence means. But when you're coming to advising moments, whether it's based on one study or hundreds of studies, there has to be a synthetic moment where you say what it all means. And because the evidence is never going to be complete, there's always that inferential gap. I don't think values fill that gap, right? I think values allow you to step across it, right? It says when the gap is, you're comfortable stepping across it, given the uncertainties, given the risks you take by stepping across it, given what might happen if you're wrong one way or the other. And I think we saw that a lot with COVID-19. right? So, did we have the, most perfect evidence that there was a pandemic in, say, February, and people began to be really alarmed about this? No, we had, evidence of people dying of diseases in particular places. We had a couple of anecdotal cases of asymptomatic transmission. We had some preliminary death rates that looked like it was an order of magnitude higher than flu. Like, this is not by any means the kind of evidence we have now in front of us today regarding COVID-19, but it was enough to make people go, wait a second. If we're wrong about this, we're in deep trouble. And I think that pushed governments to move quickly. Not quickly enough. I mean, New Zealand moved quickly enough. You guys have had a great run in 2020. I know you're frustrated not being able to leave New Zealand, but you can go to restaurants, which most of us are still not doing. At least I haven't been to a restaurant in over a year quite happily, because I view that risk as too high. But so there's sort of this moment where you're like, is this evidence enough given the errors, risk of errors on either side, given what I'm concerned with, given what I want to protect, given what's most important to me? And I think that's a really important moment of judgment in science. And I think that that is an ineliminable, crucial aspect of scientific judgment. I also think that the framing of science advice is a really important moment of judgment. When you decide what is of importance, what is sort of within the frame, what evidence is actually going to be considered relevant depending on how you formulate the problem. So I think those are sort of both really important moments of judgment in science that should be informed by the values that you have.
I think that leads to the question that I think I often confront when I have discussions on science advice, which is the confusion between values as you've just explained and described them, and biases. And I think that we see a lot of time people wanting to conflate these things to advocate, to use Roger's terms of advocacy. I think people are using the word values to reflect what are really ideological or other biases they want to bring onto the table. And I've always felt that the role of the science advisor is to leave that element of judgment to the democratic process, not to the science advisor. It's hard, but I think that's where it sits. And I just wonder whether there's a better language or a better way of communicating these differences, because I think it's critically important in how science advice gets constructed.
Yeah, so I think science should be continually worried about biases. If you think of biases as systematic deviations from the truth, science, although I don't think we actually know when we have the truth, science and the practice of knowledge construction is always concerned with pursuing the truth and getting at the truth, even if you're never really sure when you have it. That means that biases, anything that's going to drive you systematically away from an understanding that's accurate, is going to be an ongoing problem. I think the confusion arises because some value influences have led to biases, that people assume that when I say science is value-laden, what I'm saying is that science is necessarily biased. Those things need to be pulled apart. And we can see that they should be pulled apart when we think about the way in which value influences in science have actually led people to the truth in some cases. There have been important value influences that have led to more accurate understandings of the world, such as the work of feminist primatologists, women primatologists, recognizing the importance of female primate behavior. Or when you decide that you want more evidence before deciding that something is safe, and you discover that something might actually be toxic along the way, right? So there's nothing about value-ladenness that means you're going to be biased. So we have to pull those apart and see those as separate, and then worry about what causes bias, right? What causes those systematic deviations? In the realm of science policy and science advice, it's really clear that if you have an ideological commitment, that means you're not willing to entertain the possibility that something you believe about the world is wrong. And it turns out that you are wrong. you're going to be biased and you're going to be biased in a really sort of intransigent, problematic way. So I don't want to lay that at the feet of value-ladenness. I want to lay that at the feet of ideological commitment and bias. And so then we have to think, how do you make sure that people don't entrench their views in a place where they can't even countenance contrary evidence, right? Because that is so unscientific. The whole point of being open, non-dogmatic in science is being open to new evidence, is being open to new theories. If you've entrenched your position into one where you can't countenance new evidence, where you can't consider that you might actually be wrong about the way the world works, how can you possibly take on science advice?
And we've had examples in history of the strong ego dominating in science advice in that way. I think of the tragedy of South Africa and HIV/AIDS and the influence of a single person on the President Mbeki, which delayed the introduction of therapies for antiviral therapies, which was tragic. I think you can argue that what happened in the United States at times last year with Dr. Atlas had similar impacts. And so I think one of the issues is the role of the individual scientist as opposed to the collective in how science and society interact.
Yeah, so one of the things that I have been trying to get scientists to do is first acknowledge more openly the role of value judgments in their work, because I see that as a really crucial bridge to trust. Right, so the members of the public who might not understand all the intricacies of scientific evidence generation, scientific debate, of the complexities of expert judgment, can, when they hear an expert talk about their work and say, what I cared about was this, and what I wanted to make sure I avoided by, not by making sure my methodologies were strong enough, or by not waiting too long before saying something, was this sort of outcome. The public sees in those expressions of what the scientist cares about, and having an expert who's going to make judgments like you would if you had their expertise. Those are the experts that you're going to want to trust, right? So I view the values as something that can actually bridge to trust with the public. And this has actually been empirically borne out in particular cases. So there has been, for example, studies of communication around climate change to various communities in the US. There's a lot of climate denialism and climate resistance. But one of the more effective communicators to some of these communities has been a climate scientist who shared, for example, an evangelical faith. And she could go to the evangelical churches and say, I am an evangelical like you. This is what I care about. This is what the science says to me. And she became a really trusted communicator about these issues to those communities.
I've always felt, and both when I'm talking to the public or when I was talking to prime ministers, and I worked for 3 prime ministers across the political spectrum, that you had to acknowledge their positions and their values, even though you, at least up front, before you actually then gave your advice in a bias-free manner as to what the science suggested. And I think in acknowledging that, you can actually be seen as trusted. And I think we're going to see that importantly in dealing with the anti-vax movement, in terms of acknowledging the different reasons why people may be concerned about the vaccine. If you actually acknowledge that before you say to them, these are the reasons why you should take the vaccine, and at least explain, at least acknowledge up front the genuine concerns, whatever they are, wherever they come from, that have led people to a choice which will be potentially harmful for them, you're more likely to change their opinion. And I think that we've not been very good about this. And of course, this comes to another domain of where you have a lot to contribute, I think, Heather, and that is, this is getting scientists out of the business of being priests, preaching truth from the altar to the congregation, and actually how the social contract between science and society is changing. And I think that, yes, we went through a period perhaps 20 years ago, where there was a big shift from that very separate positioning to a more integrated positioning. But I think it's changing again, don't you?
I do. I think it's changing in really exciting ways. So one of the big changes that I see over the last 20 years is a change in the views about responsibilities for scientists and about responsibilities to society in particular. So if you go back to, the Society for Freedom in Science, 1940, 1945, their argument was that if you're doing basic or pure research, you have no responsibilities to society. Your job is just to produce truth, and someone else will decide what to do with it. I think one of the things that's happened is, over the 20th century, that became increasingly difficult as ethical issues around human subject research arose and animal subject research arose. But then once you have dual use research concerns arising after the anthrax attacks, it becomes really clear that the only people who are really well positioned to think about potential implications of your work as a scientist, including informational implications, is the scientist doing the agenda. And so there has to be some responsibility that is vested with the scientist. And that's why you see now statements like the AAAS Statement on Freedom and Responsibility and the World Economic Forum Code of Young Scientists say, your intentions have to be good and you have to have foresight. You have to think through what the implications might be and aim for making the world better. My view is the minimum floor for scientists should be you should not make the world worse, right? Like you might not be able to make the world better, but you shouldn't make the world worse. And that includes, in foreseeable ways. If you make the world worse and it was totally unforeseeable, you'll be forgiven. You might feel awful about it, but you'll be forgiven. But if you knew better, if you thought like, oh, I could release this, someone could really use this for harm, but it's not my job to prevent that, and someone does use it for harm, you're not the sole responsibility. You're not maybe even the primary responsibility, but there will be responsibility that will sit with you. And that shift is dramatic, because once you have that shift, all these other things begin to follow in place.
So do you think that we have to do something about the training of scientists? Because outside medicine and perhaps veterinary and the related subjects, there's no actual requirement for training of scientists in ethics, in the philosophy of their business, and so forth. And are we at the point where a fundamental shift in the ways universities operate, in the way that people are trained in the business of science, needs to change?
Yes. So the way in which students who are now trained are trained, either they have to learn the facts as undergraduates, but then, for research ethics, they get compliance-based ethics. You just have to meet the compliance regulatory requirements and then you're done. That is completely inadequate to meeting the societal responsibilities that are woven through science. And so we have to change the training away from compliance-based ethics towards a more holistic, responsibility-based ethics. And I think one of the ways, Hannah Wallach gave a great keynote at NeurIPS this past December where she talked about this. And I think one of the ways in which to do this is to rethink the courses that we give, so that there is, whenever you're teaching a new technique, a new approach, a new area, the ethics is woven in. It's part of the science and it's part of the discussion. Initially, that might mean that you need to team teach with someone from the humanities, as the scientists get more comfortable with that. But it can't be like a separate course altogether. It can't be something that you can do an online training module in. And then for the institutionalized practice of science, one of the sort of more promising things that I see has happened over the past 20 years is, instead of thinking about research ethics as like, something, a gate you have to go through to get your IRB approval, you should get your IACUC approval, you have to get your biosafety lab up to snuff. Like, these are like compliance-based ethics. They've begun having these consultative practices that are advisory of interdisciplinary teams of research. In the US, they're called Research Ethics Consultations, RECs, which I think is a terrible acronym because it sounds like you're going to destroy the research project. Instead, what's going to happen is you're going to get good advice about how to think about your research agenda and all the complicated ethical issues that you might be stepping into from a range of social scientists, natural scientists, and humanists. And I think that that's going to be really important for doing good science going forward.
So if we just take that and go towards the business of science advising, and here I'm using it largely in the interaction between science and the policymakers, but acknowledging that can't be done without the interaction also with the community at large. Science advising is really a truly transdisciplinary activity. You know, it's not that every scientist can be a science advisor or in a role, because it's more than just knowing your discipline and being the world expert on the toxicology of this drug or whatever. It's something much broader than that. And I'm just wondering whether these boundary functions are going to need a different form of training or a more inclusive form of training than the traditional role or way we train most scientists in a reductionist disciplinary manner.
So I think you're absolutely right that I think the skills of a science advisor are particular and complex. I'm not sure you can be trained to do them well. It might be like science communication. Not every scientist can be trained to be a great science communicator, but going through some kind of training lets scientists know, am I comfortable doing this? Or is this really sort of outside of the bailiwick that I'm comfortable with, given who I am, the particular character traits I have, the particular tendencies I have as a person. And so it might be that, training for science communication, training for science advice is really something that we should be thinking a lot more about, but it's not something that we can train everyone to do, given how challenging it is. I mean, you're absolutely right. It can't be, if you're a scientist who's really sort of only comfortable in your particular expertise, in your particular discipline, and you really only like talking to your fellow colleagues, science advising is going to be a terrible job for you. I mean, you're going to have to talk to a lot of people outside of your discipline, and then you have to learn how to talk to the politicians and the general public. I mean, wow, it's a lot. I'm amazed. You are one of the people who's 3 prime ministers. That's amazing.
Well, I think it comes to, I think there's obviously different systems of science advice, and we could get into the issue of individuals versus committees and their function. But I think the issue is really one of how can you be a trusted and effective communicator with different audiences. And I know you've spoken about that really recently in Lisbon. But I think in the context of that is the business of distinguishing the claim that the science advisor doesn't have to know everything, from that they have to be the translator, the interpreter between the communities, because what the policymaker needs to know and what the scientists want to tell them is not always the same thing.
Exactly. And I think that's why your point that knowing what is of interest to the advisee, knowing what concerns them, and framing the advice within that, even if your advice is going to explicitly challenge that. I mean, there are probably times when you've had to give advice where you say, I know you're really concerned about X, but the thing is, you really need to also be worried about Y, or maybe the concern about Y comes first, because without Y, you can't get X, or Y is going to overwhelm any concern about X.
I often found the issue was making sure that you got, in that line, Heather, was the issue was getting alignment between the question that the policymaker wanted to make and the answer that the academy or whoever it is wanted to make. And often the academies want to show off their academic and intellectual expertise in a way that actually turns off the policy-making audience that needs to actually understand what is important. And often it was very simple concepts that were misunderstood between the parties. Relative risk versus absolute risk, concepts like that are fundamental to the choices that a policymaker makes.
Yeah, and so being the broker in that system takes the complicated things you're getting from the academy and puts it into the right frame for the policymaker, given the things that they care about and maybe that you have evidence that they should care about.
And then you have the problem on the scientific side, which of the scientist who believes their little observation is the most important thing that's ever happened, and the policymaker must listen. And that is where the relationship between the science advisory mechanism and the science community itself can be complex.
Exactly. And I think, thinking of the science advisor as someone who has obligations to the scientific community for accuracy and making access to all the complicated expertise there without allowing the sort of egos involved to really sort of drive the sense of importance, because you're absolutely right, that can happen too. Having obligations to the advisee, making sure that what you're speaking to is relevant to them in ways that they can understand, that is clear and communicative. But also, I think it's really important to have a sense of obligation to the public, because very often the public needs to understand the advice that you are giving to a politician, especially when the politician then uses that advice to justify decisions, right? I think you've made a really nice job clarifying that, like, early on in policymaking, you can have these, private conversations where you steer politicians, towards particular solutions. But once a politician is using the advice as justificatory, that advice has to be public, or the advisor has to be willing to correct it, so that the public can assess their politician with respect to their action advice.
It also raises the question, you used the word before about trust, and you've also written a lot about experts. And the issue is, in my mind, is there a risk that politicians are one form of elite, scientific experts are another form of elite? Is there a risk that a declining trust in politicians, which is not universal, but it's near universal, at a decline, could that lead to a declining trust in science as well, if we are not careful in how science is conducted and projected?
If the public views the scientists as just another tool of the politicians who they are increasingly distrusting, that is a huge problem. And that's why the science advisor has to feel like they have an obligation to the public to be clear about what they're saying. And also why they also have to feel like they have an obligation to the scientific community to be accurate with respect to the advice that they're giving. It's those 3 lines of obligation that made your life so difficult as a science advisor. But meeting those 3 lines is crucial to the trust of the science advisor.
So Heather, where do you think the social contract in science is going to emerge, say 10 years from now? How do you think that the relationship between, in a world in which we're awash in information, whether it's correct or not correct, and where I've seen a lot of policymakers just go to Mr. Google or Mr. Wikipedia for their answers, how do you think that this is going to evolve over the next decade? Where is your own research taking you? Where should people like myself and the people who are at these boundary functions, how should it evolve over the next decade?
So I would like to see a greater acceptance of the value-ladenness, not biasing of science advice and scientific practice, to embrace that as part of the necessary aspects of doing science, and to not view it as something that is damaging to scientific authority or the reliability of scientific expertise. I'm actually going to be trying to work on how to think about all the different aspects of science policy interfaces, because I think one of the things, if you look back at the history of science policy and you see, if you view the post-World War II context as sort of seminal for the coming together of a lot of these norms, of freedom from responsibility, of the linear model for science funding, of the independent science advisor model, of the deficit model for science communication, all of these things sort of coalesced, and a lot of them made the value-free ideal of science look really sort of obvious and necessary. But we've seen the deficit model be empirically critiqued. Publics that actually have better rates of science literacy in terms of facts actually are more critical of science consensus in some cases. We've seen, the ongoing criticisms of the linear model of science funding. I have raised criticisms of the independence model for science advisors and the value-free ideal. So if we take apart this system of concepts, then we need to rethink them. There need to be norms. There need to be any ideals that structure this. What should those ideals be? And my work over the next couple years is going to be focused on providing the most robust answers I can to that question, because I think that's going to be super important for science-society relationships going forward. If science needs to be done in and with society, then the social contract has to be rewritten. And what that should look like is part of what I want to have help with from everyone over the coming decade.
Heather, thank you very, very much. I mean, you and I could talk on for hours about many of the issues you've raised in that last response, but let's have you back another time to talk about that in more detail. Thank you very much. Heather Douglas, a great philosopher of science and a great thinker on the issues of how science and policy interact. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter. It was fun.